Great. And with the Language Keeper interviews, so Scott Tilton has agreed to do this interview. It'll be an hour and a half. It'll be public, so it'll be fully available on YouTube. After we finish our talk, I will give you a copy of it. If there's anything you want to take out, just do that. Also, while you're talking, if there's anything that you feel like you realize you don't want to say, just say, please take that out. That would be very helpful too.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so it'll be fully public. You own the rights to this interview, so you're free to do whatever you wish later. And you're also free to just revoke your rights for me later if you want to too. So the reason we're doing these interviews is just to get a better sense of like the language diversity that's happening and what makes people involved in doing the work of language rather than just being, just like passive speakers. So yeah, I guess if you're okay with us going forward, we're ready to go.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to take this out of the shot a little bit. But yeah, if you want, tell me your life story in about 5 minutes.
Sure. So my name is Scott Tilton. I am the executive director of the New Foundation. I was born and raised in New Orleans, so I guess that was always kind of one of the touchstones for me, was being really born into the culture and having a family that is really, it's a fascinating family, especially my dad's side. In particular, which is like really rooted in Louisiana. I owe so much to my mother and my father for my passion for language, but my dad's side has this sort of anchorage in Louisiana that, beyond just like genealogy, what I always thought was interesting, it's something that they wanted to bring into the present. So for language in Louisiana, we always talk about transmission as being kind of the breakage, which is a huge problem, like during Jim Crow, and all of these policies were put into place that denied language and denied the passation of minority languages in Louisiana and heritage languages. And my family was impacted by that. I think that was in part of that, but I think there was always this sort of desire to keep identifying, particularly with kind of the French language in the state. And so we ended up having, part of the language was passed on. So first to my grand-mère's generation, there was Omer Dupuis, who was a big language activist. There was my grand-mère, who kind of was born at the tail end of when they started really implementing policies to ban French in New Orleans in particular, which would have been a little bit earlier than the rest of the state. But she was born, so there's a little bit of a gap between her siblings who spoke better French than she did and her, but she was always a very passionate about the language. So via my grand-mère and then passing on to my father, we ended up having this sort of passion for French. And I'm not sure I realized it until really about Hurricane Katrina. So I would have been about 13 at the time. But what I thought was so fascinating about it was, I think at that juncture in particular, we went through the devastation of Katrina. I always joked about my grandmother being like the Creole unsinkable Molly Brown, refusing to leave town. My parents were emergency personnel as doctors, so we had to stay. They were loath to send their 4 children, who were all basically teenagers, out of town. So they kept us with them, which God bless them. I think that we may have been bigger tyrants than terrorists and all of that. But it was just so interesting to see the sort of generational, I think my grand-mère, who would have been born in a city of like New Orleans when it would have been a major American city, the Creole culture would have been very much infused into the DNA of the city. I think she took Katrina very hard for that reason, and she always joked about that. It's like, when the Creoles were in this city, this would have never happened. But it was just that it started making me think as a young adolescent that, okay, I know we got these people in my family who speak French. I understand that this is somewhat of a quirk about our family, but what do they mean by the term Creole? What do they mean? They would use French and Creole interchangeably. And I sometimes joke that when they're conservative or French, when they're liberal or Creole. But and that represents a certain reality in the state's history about why they would have kind of layered those identities. But after Katrina, when everyone was deciding like why move back to this city, like it was totally devastated. I think we all had to make a conscious choice. And I think a lot of it came down to family. A lot of it came down to those roots and the idea of not abandoning it. And I think that from the culture, there's a sense of stakeholders, that this is a culture that we helped create among many cultures, but that was something that has a special attachment to the culture that my family felt like it's a part of. And so it just sort of started sparking in me this interest for language, for And at the same time, so my dad started speaking with me a little bit more in French. I started inquiring a little bit more from that generation that still spoke French, why we spoke French, and practicing with them. And then I also had this really wonderful opportunity to meet Albina Sylvan, who was part of my life, is a part of my life still. And she is from the island of St. Lucia. So she is a St. Lucian Creole speaker. But there was also a woman who, when we moved down to the French Quarter, we're living kind of between here and Old Metairie, a woman that spoke Louisiana Creole. So I was kind of relating at the same time. So there's St. Lucian Creole that I'm basically being able to speak daily and learning, at the same time that I'm learning French. And then in parallel, I'm understanding that there's this Louisiana Creole language that exists, which is separate from French, but is obviously part of the same language ecosystem that was there. So I think it was this sort of crucible moment of my life when I was in my early teenage years to start understanding, okay, so like when we mean Creole, it's an identity. Not all Creoles necessarily speak Louisiana Creole, but clearly people who feel part of my culture do. There's also this idea that we may be part of this broader Caribbean sphere. And then obviously on top of that, there are people who understand that this is connected to, to France and other places. And so I think that I started understanding from a young age the layered identities around language and how some of those identities and how what we perpetuate are problematic too. I think that's important to realize and recognize that sometimes, the kind of ad nausea debate in Creole is like, who is a Creole? And I'm sitting there, a Creole is someone who identifies as a Creole. It's like, at the end of the day, in the South, we need to stop forcing people to define what they are and just when they say who they are, believe them. And I think that was sort of a lifeline process for me as well, that I understood that my family identified, some of them did as Creole, some of them said they were French, that's fine. I grew up with people around me who also were Afro-descendant, who identified as part of the same culture. And that's part of the history, and that's part of that expansive view of it, because that is the same culture. I took that interest in language. It sort of kept germinating in me and growing and growing and growing. I had the opportunity to study at the University of Virginia, which I joke was my study abroad. I loved it, but it was such a different culture. But while I was there, I worked with this wonderful thesis advisor, Jennifer Tien, who was from New Orleans. Her family was originally from Taiwan, El Salvador, New Orleans, and I think she had a deep connection to the city, but through a very different lens. But she advised me on this wonderful thesis that it was about the impact of Plessy v. Ferguson. And that was an important milestone for me because it was sort of the aha moment, where Plessy v. Ferguson was this case in 1896 in which you had Omer Plessy sit on a rail car in New Orleans and challenged, he was Afro-descendant but passed white under that sort of arbitrary distinction. And he challenged binary systems of race that were being imposed. And the reason why he did that is because he would have been born a free man of color in New Orleans. He would have had a different construction of racial identity. And he would have understood that like the binary racial categorization was really, detrimental and destructive. And I think that it started dawning on me that a lot of the things that happened, the dismantling of the culture of Creole culture writ large, was dated back to this period and even prior, in that it was a sort of, and that's what I wanted to study, was how did this happen? How did, we understand that Creole culture is sort of in some way, it exists, but it's still in some ways a shadow. It's not a dominant culture. So how did we get there? And how did we, what were the forces and the policies and the biases that made us get there? And so I thought it was that aha moment with Plessy v. Ferguson about understanding how other systems of racial identification under other forms of socioeconomic orientation could exist, and how the pillars of this culture, many of them problematic as well, rooted in slavery, rooted in colonialism, rooted in problematic tendencies, but that gave certain mobility to certain communities, how that culture thrived in a space, and then how, when it kind of came up against Jim Crow, binary racial segregation, the complete dismantling of heritage cultures. It wasn't just Creoles. These policies attacked multiple communities. How that just fell apart, and how there's this echo to the past of, people legally fighting it, and legally fighting it with all of their will. And how 1896 is basically, it's only about 15, 16 years from my grand-mère's birth. And so how that dismantling of that culture, and it would only have been about 8-9 years from her siblings' births, how that case in which you have basically after that the complete collapse of a culture, at least people having to identify across in a binary racial system, people leaving parts of the city that they were historically living in, and how that had an impact on dividing families, how then right after that my family, a generation that I would have known very intimately, was being born, and how they were being born and basically having, with parents making decisions about their identity, and how they didn't necessarily have the language to talk all the time. So they were kind of blending language around Creole, French, this, that, and the other. Whereas I think that for the generation prior to them, that would have been a much more clear identity. And so I think that research that I did with Jennifer Chin was eye-opening, illuminating in ways that I also realized that we just don't talk about in Louisiana. It's not in a textbook. I probably deliberately erased from schools. And I was just thinking about that whole process, and that's what it made me realize, question about what does it mean to be a francophone, even if it's an acquired second language. What does that mean, and what privileges did that offer me? And it offered me this wonderful opportunity to go to France and study at Sciences Po. And I think that there's sort of this echoing of the past where I met my husband there in France, Rudy Bazinet. He's from Clermont-Ferrand. And he had just moved back from Slovenia, so I'm not sure he thought he knew what he was about to get entailed into moving to Louisiana eventually, the pauvre Tibet. But he was so funny. We met at the time. He was a diplomat. I was studying at Sciences Po. I went to this conference on the economy of an organization called the Francophonie. And the Francophonie is really fascinating because it has its own challenges. It's rooted in elements of colonialism. With the International Organization for Francophonie brings together 88 countries and regions. Not all of them are French-speaking regions, but they kind of tie them together in the way that the United Nations does. And it is rooted in this sort of post-colonial project. But what's interesting is a lot of different parts of the world have used it locally, politically, to kind of leverage either in some context language rights or economic ties and things like that. So what was interesting for me from a Louisiana perspective, what's sort of reaching into the past of my own family's experiences, I realized that we just don't have any status in Louisiana. We have an agency that protects us to a certain degree with Codafil, but we just don't have, there's no official language status for French or any heritage language, Louisiana Creole, indigenous communities. There's no status. So in that world, English just sort of takes the predominant role, and we were talking about this in the past, but only 8% of Louisianans speak another language. So it's a huge challenge about that. How do you protect really a very small minority's language rights, a minority language rights that is part of a larger contiguous whole, because there's a lot of people who are from these communities but don't speak the language anymore. And so the reason why so at the time I met Rudy, we launched and directed this initiative as civil society actors to have Louisiana join the international organization, the Francophonie. And the goal in that was recognition, it was to give a status that if Louisiana joins the Francophonie, then there are certain obligations that the state needs to protect, to be able to hold that status and to be able to acknowledge that these language communities exist, and that on the other end of it, there is also just sort of an idea of capacity that this organization can support education initiatives, it can support culture, the arts. And so I think that there was this interesting echo. We worked on that from 2016 until 2018, and that ended up working out, which was wonderful. But I think that there was this sort of come full circle about that because it ended up, as I was going through the process of researching and understanding how the politics had dismantled the culture, basically, it was nice to start, even if it's just the first stone in the river, starting the process of making politics serve the communities. And I think that there was the beginning of that process, and it's not the end point. I kept saying that when we got into the Francophonie, that this is the beginning, not the destination, that we need to move somewhere with this. And not to kind of be long-winded about the answer, but that's what took me to work on the new foundation. I think it's a kind of contiguous whole from Katrina and my own family through the Francophonie to today. And the reason why we wanted to create the new foundation is I always give the example in Paris of these cultural institutions, and they're wonderful places. I give the example of the Finnish Institute. Not, the Finnish language is wonderful, but there's not a million people in Paris learning Finnish on a given day. But they created such a welcoming space, such a cool space, such Nordic chic, that everyone goes there. Everyone goes there. All the students go there, grab a good coffee, they study there, and it's just such a dynamic space. And it has such good soft power, so to speak, for the Finnish culture, because everyone wants to be there. They hear Finnish musicians play and all that. And I thought about that in the context of Louisiana, that one of the things that we're missing is visibility and capacity. And so what we wanted to do was create a cultural institution that would, bring these cultures to the forefront. And it's an expansive view of what those cultures are. Yes, I'm Creole. I love Creole. I love being Creole. I'm willing to proselytize and defend the culture. But it's also about Cadian. It's also about indigenous people. They like communities, varied communities that exist across Louisiana. And all of these heritage communities to try to find a space that we can, that they know is home to a certain degree. It's a home that's always being built. It's a home that needs to be built together, but it's hopefully a more expansive and inclusive space than existed prior, certainly during Jim Crow. So hopefully that is being built as a community. So that's kind of our vision behind the new foundation. And so the kind of like elevator pitch is that we are a cultural center, so we do film projections and language classes and exhibitions. As a creative studio, we curate exhibitions. So we did a wonderful exhibit called Haiti, Louisiana, Tides of Freedom that talked about the impact of the Haitian Revolution, both on Haiti and Louisiana as an ongoing project. And as something that really expanded the definition of human rights, challenged the system of slavery, but one that is incomplete. Because there are still forms of extraction and sort of modern, indenturitude that exists still. And so that was a wonderful project that we got to work on with artists from Haiti, from Louisiana. That's a project that after this will go to the United Nations, and I think is incarnating the idea that something that is born in Louisiana, born in heritage languages, can kind of be given a really great stage. The stage here is the primary one. We want it for Louisianians. But we also want to help spread that message that coming from Louisiana, that these cultures are here, and that they've never, that their voice is loud, that it's here and it's expressive, and that it's changing and challenging some of the challenges that we have in Louisiana. And then the final thing we are is like a program maker. So we do like a lot of mobility grants to have scholars come to Louisiana and vice versa to work on kind of creative projects typically, so jazz and research on theater, and the idea is just to have particularly in this case, the French language be a vector of opportunity for scholars to be able to go to France, French scholars to come here. The hope is to expand that with Canada, Senegal, across the world. That way a lot of these researchers are coming to Louisiana, and that creates like collaborations that reinforces the use of language in professional settings. And then we also have a program called Le La, which we worked on with Homo Language Project, which is a wonderful program where we support cultural keepers in just in whatever capacity they need. So like in whatever would be the most useful for their project, because it's them creating the innovative project, it's us in a supportive capacity. So some organizations have gone for nonprofit status, so we just kind of become an open book and share all of our documents, so it facilitates the process. Some are looking for grants, so we apply for grants and we get the funding, and then we give all that money to them. So that's been kind of one of our ways to really be a community touch point, that it's not just about French, it's not just about our identity. It's also about supporting other heritage communities and letting all of these projects emerge, because we could be one project, as I said, you can throw one stone into a river, but if you're not working together, then it really makes no sense. And so I think that's part of that vision, and I think it comes from, as I was saying from the beginning, it's like there is this whole political project to dismantle these cultures. And culture, everyone knows in Louisiana, it's complex. So Creole culture is not this shining city on a hill that we should emulate it, without any critique. It's just that it was unjust, the dismantling of it. And I think that we should think today as a project that we need to work across communities that have lived through the same experience, varied in their own way, because it's sadly that's the perniciousness of these policies, is that they attack each community a different way. But there is a common thread that each of these communities across Louisiana, Indigenous, Cadian, Creole, other, and many that I can't, that exist, because it's also like a, all of these communities live through this variation of this experience. So I think working across those communities is a way for us to start combating that.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And you talked a little bit about, what French was, or what French and Creole and what those languages were as you were growing up. As someone who's involved in the space now, can you give us an understanding of what you see the languages contemporarily within the spaces that you work?
Yeah, I think, I always joke, so all French is good French in that world, if we're talking about French. Louisiana, we have such a variety of accents, and we have such a variety of language, and we have
I think it's more of just like, within the languages that you work with, what's the current status of it? What's the health of the languages? Or what
it's varied. We have this sort of, it's bifurcating to a certain degree. You have native speakers who probably, honestly, if they're young, they're in their 70s. Maybe if they're in reality, they're probably in their 80s, 90s, or sadly past. And then we have young learners who, because of the immersion schools. So Louisiana, I think, has like 35 French immersion programs now. So there's several thousand kids in those schools. And and some of the people that went through the first immersion schools are now in their like 30s, 40s. So there's a generational gap that's hard to fill, of knowledge about the language and everything of that nature. So I think that it's the absolute number of speakers are going down, but I kind of, there's kind of damn lies statistics. It's hard to tell what the numbers are really. I mean, I think about my own family, about, if you were to give a census record to them, there's at least a third of my family that could speak French. But if you give them a census, form, they're not going to answer French. Do you speak French at home? No, I don't speak French at home. I speak French at cocktail parties. But the reality is the reason they speak French is because they have that family tie to it. So the sad thing is they'll never show up. And I think in Louisiana, that's a reality that, with the official statistics and the censuses are not calibrated necessarily for the reality of language loss. So that when we're thinking about like status and the health of it, it's hard because we have this generational divide between native speakers who really are, keepers of the culture, younger students who are going through these immersion schools, and a lot of them have teachers from France and Belgium and that's wonderful for kind of global view of it, that they don't feel isolated, that there are other people that speak this. But I think that officially, there are not many safeguards to protect our languages. I think that the immersion schools are delicate. They close programs quite regularly. They open some, and I think that creates a kind of a tenuous, it's a foundation that can be difficult to work on, particularly with the charter schools in Louisiana. It's not the charter schools are interesting because through the charter schools, we could open all these immersion schools, but charter schools can get opened and closed, and that's the model. And so the reality is they can be closed from one year to another. So even if you're investing in that model, hopefully the outcomes are better in certain contexts. But it's not like a school that is assured its continuity. So I think that if I were to characterize the state of language today in Louisiana of these languages, it's that it's delicate, that it's promising, that it's better than it was. We have a lot, but we have a very long way ahead of us. And I think that what we have today is an infrastructure, but I worry sometimes that we don't necessarily have a foundation. And so I think that what we're doing at NEW is working as quickly as possible to build a foundation for it, literally a new foundation. But I also think that, I joke that we sometimes are like ducks, we kind of gracefully floating, but underneath we're paddling constantly to try to figure it out. And so my hope of where we'll be in the next couple of years is that we will have multiple institutions, civil society and governmental, that have resources to be investing in the infrastructure. So rather than be top down, bottom up, So it's obviously if it's governmental, it's somewhat top down, but I just hope that civil society emerges and is strong. Because we need that. We desperately need that to protect the schools, to protect, to have businesses and things that help people. I guess that's another element that's a problem, a challenge today is that we rely on the kindness of strangers. We rely on people to give so much of their time, so much of their energy, and we are not compensating them nearly at the levels that they should be, and it exhausts people. And I think we need more civil society organizations, more businesses that are able to invest in people and give them salaries so that they feel that they're not being exploited in the process of their culture, because the reality is the problem that we're in the first place about this is because the culture's felt exploited. And so I think it's going to be a challenge moving forward. So I hope that answers the question, but I think that my joke about living in Louisiana is the ability to have two contradicting thoughts at the same time without having your head explode. And so I think that that's the reality, is that's where we are today, is that it's promising. It is probably the best overture that we have had in decades to not resurrect it, because we don't need to resurrect the past, but to build something new that offers something that Louisiana cannot offer today, and language being a pillar of that. But it's delicate.
It's very delicate. Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying about having this infrastructure, but maybe not a foundation. I had never thought about that before. That's really great. Just letting you know, we're about halfway through with our time, and we have a few questions left. But
sure.
I think that you've covered most of the things, so thank you so much. But thinking about, what you were talking about a little bit was some of the challenges that you guys face. Can you describe a little bit about what would make this work easier for you?
Yeah, there's to be honest, there's the rise of the far right. I think Rudy and I have dealt with a lot of homophobia. We are a gay couple, we are proudly gay, and that's not an identity I would ever walk away from, nor should I. But I think that we sometimes get a lot of, we're conscientious about outreach, and we're conscientious about building a team that's inclusive, and we're conscientious about expectations about what we can support and at what level, so that we don't set the bar so high and then under deliver, and then people get jaded about that. I think sometimes what scares us is that more and more in the last couple of years, people kind of say we're urbane, or that we're New Orleanians, and I think I take some of that to be that it's a thinly veiled term for you're gay. And I think the sad part about that is it's something that we feel, it's something that we've heard, and I think that the far right's emergence and the dealing with homophobia at times is no matter what the best of intentions, if someone can't accept your identity, it's hard to accommodate, it's hard to work with them. And I think that's a challenge. When I lived in Paris, I didn't have to deal with that. In New Orleans, at times, it's a wonderful city. It's the Café des Exilés. It's a city that offers a space for us and that we can live in a bubble, but I think that we need to not live in a bubble, and I think we need to confront what's happening around us, because it's very real. And so I think that's been a big challenge for us. At an organizational level, too, we just, resources, right? Like funding and stable funding, and we're 2 full-time employees on this. And we made a lot of sacrifices over the years, to forego salaries and to just countless hours in the evening working on grants and things to get to a stable point. We have Katya, who works for us, who's a wonderful graphic designer. But I think I could just only imagine if it's us 2 working on it full time, and then Katya 1 day a week, but to have Katya working all the time, and us with 2 or 3 people, and that we don't have to do development and graphic design and all of the admin and all of this. I think it would be wonderful to be able to have that capacity. And I think that when organizations from abroad that are publicly funded at high levels, they don't understand that we are a shoestring team. We are very few people. And it's just because we made a commitment not to engage people on our project without paying them. So we can pay people at the capacity that's a living wage based off the amount of time that we give them a living wage based off the time that we can pay them. And so I think, that's a challenge, because I think people are thinking we're literally 10 people, and we're not. We're most certainly not. And I think the communities we serve for good reasons, I'm happy that we can represent an institution, to be institutional and distant, but I think that we represent something that seems professional, that seems like it has capacity, that it can work with communities and work in a way that's ethical and empowering. And I think that I'm thrilled that there are so many communities and projects that are asking us for support. But there's that kind of mismatch between what we're able to deliver on right now and our own capacity. And I think that that's, as an organization, the biggest challenge. It's being resolved every day, honestly. Like, I feel like in the last year, we went from really startup mode, very startup mode, to really starting to be able to dream about what we want to be when we are older. I feel like we're new is moving into its adolescence, hopefully a less impetuous. But I think that we're moving into that adolescent phase where we're starting to come into our own and understand where we're moving. And but we're always going to be impatient about that, because we want to be what we want to be what people want us to be. And I think that beyond the salary, beyond this, it's deeply personal. It's about, I love it. I feel like we're working on something that at a personal level is very self-validating. And I think that per that first point, that's where it becomes hurtful, is that you love your community and you want to work across communities, but it's a minority very much by any stretch. But when you deal with homophobia, or you deal with thinly veiled homophobia, it's it's a regret, but illegitim non carbanorum, right?
What's the translation of that?
Don't let the bastards grind you down.
Love it. And so thinking about where you feel like there's the low points within life, but there's also the high points. And you've been doing this for a while. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what you feel like were some of the greatest successes, maybe personally or for your organization, where you felt like you were really making a difference?
Yeah, I think when we opened in March of last year with this collaboration with the historic BK House and Gardens, and it was this sort of effervescent joy of this vision that we had to open a cultural center in New Orleans. Not in a bad way. I appreciate people's practicality, but people are like, how are we going to make this happen? How are you going to make this happen? And the BK House team just had Annie Irvin and Larry Schmidt in particular had this vision of working with us, and us working with them. Obviously, we were knocking on the door, but they said yes. They brought us in. They made it easy. They've allowed for a lot of these projects to come to life. So I think that the idea that, okay, the brick and mortar's here, that we can do this, that we don't have to be scared at all times. Do we pay for salary, or do we pay for brick and mortar and things like that? But the answer finally illuminated itself as this sort of parting of the Red Sea for us. It was such a wonderful opportunity, and it didn't come from French. It was Anglophones. It was a collaboration across that, and it just showed to us as well that we make these distinctions between sometimes with whom we think we could work, and the reality is you can work with anyone, so long as the right predisposition is there. It's without compromising one's values. But it's if there's so many professional partners, there's so many organizations and communities with one can work as well, that being open-minded and never being closed off to those opportunities opens up opportunities that you could not even dream of. So to the historic BK House and Gardens, we are eternally indebted. But yeah, I think that joy of opening of the Cultural Center was wonderful. I think the Haiti, Louisiana exhibit was another touch point where, one of our goals is to work kind of in the francophonie writ large, and that includes creolophonie and all that space. And Haiti is one that we understood. There's so many historical links to Haiti and New Orleans. 1809, 1810, the arrival of people from Saint-Domingue, and the reality about the people that arrived from Saint-Domingue is a lot of them were enslavers too. So they were not on the side of the Haitian Revolution, if we're being honest. And and they were also free people of color and obviously enslaved. So it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed legacy of how the Haitian Revolution impacted Louisiana. But Louisiana went on to reinforce a lot of the slave structure, enslaving structure from Haiti. So in some ways, we were the inheritors of Saint-Domingue, but we were inheritors of a lot of the wrong ideas of Saint-Domingue, of the wrong social structures. But we were also inheritors of the Haitian Revolution that way, that people who came brought the Haitian Revolution with them. It influenced all sorts of cascading events in Louisiana that were very important. So I thought that the exhibit was such a wonderful incarnation of that collaboration because working with Mac Jean-Louis as curator on that project, we could explore the Haitian Revolution, but also in its impact on Louisiana, but in a very complicated way. But we were able to work with artists, contemporary artists from both places, all Afro-descendant, who wanted to explore that legacy. And explore it from their lens. So it's not New Foundation telling the history of this, or the contemporary, of how the art should be made. The artist did the interpretation, they did the work, and then we had this project on the back end to work with Max about how do we thread this needle of understanding, yes, the Haitian Revolution had an impact on both places, but a complicated legacy. And I thought if we get to the core of what we want to do with the New Foundation, it's that. It's not about reinterpreting with like hoop skirts and plantations the past, because we can bury that in the ground and not necessarily need to resurrect that. We have this new opportunity via language and collaboration across languages to explore what that legacy could be today, as complicated as it could be. And Haiti and Louisiana are two spaces confronting very similar realities. Socioeconomic inequalities, political turmoil at times, the climate change, and maybe in some ways the impact of colonialism is very acute at different degrees. But I think that there are similar substrates, there's similar challenges that are just manifesting themselves differently. And I think that I was so proud of that exhibit because we brought people from Haiti. We brought people, obviously across Louisiana. And there was El Josue from Haiti. There was all of these artists that we brought in. And there was a rah-rah band with Ram that played at the opening. And it was just this sort of, again, effervescent joy where you're celebrating not just one culture, but both cultures and the cultures, how they overlap. And I think of our team, I've never been so proud. I thought that was such a moment in time and in space, and it was just a fun evening. So I guess, those two moments. I'm proud of what we did with the Library of Congress, too. We got this grant recently to do a music documentation project to work with musicians across Louisiana. And maybe the reason we're going to cut a vinyl with them, and then we're going to also do a publication and an exhibit. And the idea is to kind of, what's the contemporary canon? Is it not that everyone on this album is an incarnation of everyone in Louisiana who sings in Louisiana French and Creole, but we get to work with several very talented musicians and cut a vinyl with them. This is for posterity's sake, going to the archives of the Library of Congress. But the reason why I'm proud of that project is it's the first time that geographically we get to work across the state, the four corners of Louisiana. There's a musician from every corner of Louisiana working on this. And it's really cool to work with them in that capacity. And so I'm excited for that project because it's also going to be occupying my time for the next year. But I think those three projects, each one incarnates some realization of the vision that we had when we created the New Foundation, but also incarnates community buy-in about bringing, really creating a space in which I feel like the communities that we want to touch, that in some way their voices are being heard in that space, and that we're doing the administrative and sort of work about making the project come to life, but it's not a diktat about how that project needs to be manifested.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really great. And so this is a lot of we've talked so far about the work that you've done so far and the work of New Foundation. Can you talk a little bit about where you find hope or where you find inspiration or where some contemporary places that you're feeling that are bright spots with it as you go about your own work?
Yeah, there are different models of what we're working on. I love Nunu and Arnaudville. I love them. I love George Marks and Mavis Fruget. They've been doing this for a long time and for doing creative placemaking and setting up communities and spaces for their communities. And Arnaudville, in particular in St. Landry Parish, has had, it's socioeconomically faced a lot of challenges. And they really created this space for creatives to go there. And I think it's had a positive impact on their community. So at that scale, we can look at it and say, it works. It's really, so many people have told us that they go through there. And I love how expansive the vision is and how inclusive it is of a space. Outside of Louisiana, I love what they're doing in Francophone Canada, in Quebec obviously, but outside of Quebec is really interesting because Saskatchewan, Alberta have a lot of parallels to Louisiana, and it's interesting to work with partners up there who deal with a lot of the same challenges. How do you ensure services in French? How do you, in a context in which everyone also speaks English, how do you assure minority language rights? And there's also how they approach les autochtones, so like the different indigenous communities, and include them in that vision of supporting language rights, because I find that, I'm not sure, I can't speak with authority on it by any stretch, but my understanding is that oftentimes they advocate for language rights, and French is part of that. And then there's also sort of solidarity and work on providing community rights for indigenous peoples, language rights and accessibility. So I think that's something that we need to incorporate in Louisiana. I think that too long in the past we were sort of focused on this ethno-nationalist view of what language rights entail, and that was to the exclusion and reinforcing exclusion. And I think that we have an opportunity today for the first time in a long time to make that vision more expansive. So I find I'm kind of in tune with those conversations up there, and looking very directly about ways that we can incorporate that more.
And so the last question, or the last structured question, and then you can talk, we can banter as much as we want, but it's talking about resources and capacity. So think about if there were 3 versions of yourself. What would you do with those 3 versions, or where would you place them to continue working?
One would be on development, the fundraiser, the kind of the schmoozer. Just kidding, but it's just like development is important, and it takes a lot of outreach and a lot of explaining to people your mission and working with them, and community buy-in and donor buy-in, and that's a full-time job. Then there's the grant writer, Scott, who's working on writing these grants and doing that full-time, because that's I kind of have to moonlight doing that. And then there's the project person. I may put a 4th, but the project person would make, would implement all the projects and make sure that they're thoroughly done. I feel like we have a really good project management system where we're able to stay on top of projects, but there's always more of me that wants to be involved with it. And then I guess the 4th one would be the community, Scott. I would be able to be out there in the community and attend all of these events, because the problem is my great uncle used to talk, when he'd be talking about himself, and he'd joke about his wife, be like, Charlotte's tired. Whenever he was tired and want to go home. And there's sort of me that's like, Charlotte's tired. Charlotte's exhausted. So I think that there's moments where I sort of think about it in that way, where I'm just like, God, I would just love to go to all of these events and be there. And we have a board member, Heather Hodges, and she's everywhere all at once. I don't know how she does it. And so I would love to have that Energizer Bunny element to me, where I could be there at all times, and because I think that community outreach, like she's doing, is so critical. Because that's where you really meet the community. That's where they know who you are. And I think that, per my point about homophobia earlier, I think that type of community outreach, when people meet us, they realize that we're chill, we're kind, that our heart's in the right place, and that we're, doing our best. And I think that there's so much that can be kind of conjectured through distance when people can't interact with us, and then maybe prejudices seep in, that becomes sort of the prevailing narrative about us. And I think that if I could be more prevalent in the community and at all of these events, it's just that we're trying to build this project ethically. We're trying to build it sustainably. And so we got to do the development, we got to do the grant writing, we got to do the programs, and maybe at times the community side of it is what lacks for us, because we can't be everywhere all at once. So I think that's if I were to multiply ourselves. Yeah. And to Rudy Bazinet's eternal credit, we are 2 peas in a pod in life and death. We love each other, and he is my husband and life partner, and it is not easy on a professional project to be life partners, but we have figured out a way, and he is so much more talented than I am. He is just so stinking talented, and he has stepped in and done so much work, and that I am lucky as anything in the world that someone would plunge into this with me, because we both put careers on the side. We could have lived in Paris comfortably for the rest of our lives, but I joked about Paris that Paris doesn't need us. Paris needs no one. You know what I mean? Paris is Paris. And it's not to be like, think that New Orleans needs us imperatively. I just think that we have something to offer to New Orleans, to Louisiana, to the Gulf South, that could help people, and that in ways that when we're working with communities too, can also help us become better selves. And I hope that that's, I don't want the comfortable life, I want this life.
Great. And so when you're thinking about, so there's the cloning of yourself, but then there's also, this other kind of iteration of interns. And thinking about if you had 3 interns, where would you place them?
Well, we worked with one intern, I must admit, that was Martha Penny, and man, she was an amazing grant writer. I would take that in a heartbeat. I would take her in a heartbeat. She was so talented, and we've worked with wonderful interns throughout who have worked on different projects. So I guess what I would like to do with the interns in particular is I want the generational challenge that I was talking about between native speakers and younger people working on this. I would love to figure out a way, without it being exploitative, about having interns work with older generations, or in some capacity, maybe even part-time, where I would love to have them, because I think that that's how we transmit culture, language, ideas. And so I think that that would be a wonderful way. If I could have multiple interns working for us, I would figure out a way to do that more seamlessly. And then obviously I think that for interns, what's empowering too is I want them to be new today, and I want them to start their own thing tomorrow. I don't want new to be a monopoly on anything. It's not designed to be that way, nor would that be helpful to anyone. So I would love them to take the ideas that they could have from new, and hopefully working with them on like either the nonprofit management side or on the entrepreneurial side of what we're doing, like for-profit entrepreneurial side, where we're working with people who are trying to mount projects to get them more involved with like Le Lab, for example, where I would love them then to become, to start their own projects. And I think that that would be really wonderful, because I think the whole goal of this is to be an ecosystem that works across communities, very transversal, across geography, across socioeconomic class, across communities in whatever capacity that takes. And if we could have interns that become the next generation of what we're working on with language revitalization, then I think that would be really wonderful. Because, sadly, Louisiana, unlike other places, we do have a ticking time bomb. Climate change is real, no matter what people say. And our state is falling into the ocean like a tapestry being unwound. So I think that we need to be thinking language is important, and language unto its own right. But language, if we can literally change the narrative about the challenges that we face, and we can work with a younger generation, interns, for example, that they can get capacity to do whatever they want to do long term. And even if it's not us that comes up with the solution, if they can become part of that solution, as I keep making the analogy about the rock in the river, if we can keep having people work on this, and maybe one of those projects will just be so innovative that it will change everything.
That's beautiful. There's 2 things that came up that have just been like lingering questions as you've been giving your narrative. And one of them is going back to the beginning when you were talking about how you got involved. You gave 3 phases of your life, growing up in childhood, the work around Katrina and re-understanding and recontextualizing your own existence, and then this moment, this pinnacle, this core moment in both college and as when you were abroad. But in each one of these, it felt like there was this accumulation that was happening. But there's a point between like an accumulation and moving from Paris to Louisiana to do this full time, quitting the work that you were doing before. There has to be, it makes me think that there might be like a point that you decided that you were going forward with this. And I guess my curiosity was there a point of no return for you? And what was that, what were the context around that, or what made you go forward?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was any doubt in my mind that at some point I would have to be back in Louisiana. I think I had such a close attachment to this place, and always like New Orleans is as much a lifestyle as it is a place, right? But I just, you know, you can watch a train wreck from a mile away in this place, and it's not that I think that there's no messiah complex behind that. I don't think that me alone or anything of that nature could solve it. But I was just sitting there, if given every privilege from my culture growing up, that if I decided not to move back, and obviously that was a choice for two with Rudy, then, you know, we got to try at some point. You know, it's easy to leave, and I don't fault anyone for leaving this state. And, you know, if we can't offer opportunities, then who's to blame them? But I was given the privilege, and I, you know, was given a set of tools, like I was working consulting and all these things that there was, like, particularly with this project with New, I was like, you know, we can do this. You know, we really can do this, and it may have an impact that could really support the communities around us and the communities that I feel a very close attachment to. So I don't know, there was a time when I was working consulting, EY, and I enjoyed my job, but I just had this sort of recognition that, like, this was right as Louisiana was joining the Francophonie in 2018, where I went, you know, that was tough as a project. You know, we were alone for so much of it. We had to, you know, 1,000 emails, we had to go to the nth degree. We were working at 2 a.m. in Paris. And I think at the end of all of that, we got, I mean, honestly attacked by certain politicians who thought we were claiming too much of the limelight, even though Rudy and I worked so hard on that as unpaid volunteers who just wanted to see this get done. And I think I was so upset by that. You know, I think that there was also a realization living in Paris that this could be the comfortable life for the rest of my life, but at the same time, it must be more to life than that. And an attachment to the culture. And I think that at some point around 2018, early 2019, Rudy and I started working on New. And I think that would be the inflection point. Because I'll be honest, with what we worked on with the Francophonie and the ramifications that we still feel today, and I still think are rooted in homophobia as well, I don't want anyone to deal with that. It was so wrong and it was so unfair, and that I do hope that at some point, and I think that if we can empower people's work and we can support them in that process, and never, you know, it shouldn't take that much energy, and it shouldn't take that much energy to work on a heritage language, and it shouldn't be that much negative. It shouldn't be that much negative blowback when people do it voluntarily. But if we can offer another structure that empowers people from the beginning, then all the better. So I think that, I don't know when that dawning of me occurred, but I think that the negative experience of that in 2018 bred the positive reaction in 2019, which was to say, you know what? If we can't do it through certain channels, then let's do it our damn selves. You know, like, let's build it up.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And I think that kind of ties to the other kind of lingering thought that I've heard throughout this is it seems like you have it sounds like you have a clear vision in your mind of what a better place or a more comfortable like language ecosystem is for Louisiana. And I just wanted to give you a chance to, you know, if you had anything else you wanted to add to that, to kind of let us into your world of what that looks like for you.
I think it's one in which we offer opportunities that don't exist today. So I think if it's through education, it's through high-performing schools, that we offer resources in both languages and that we're expanding the horizons of children, both to their heritage cultures in Louisiana and also to the global Francophonie. I think if we can offer that, then I think that would be such a wonderful place, because you're welcoming children to think beyond the borders of the South, beyond the borders of Louisiana, beyond the South, into another space. And no matter where they land, in Louisiana, in New York, Paris, Montreal, wherever they go after, that experience of opening their that door to them here is an offer through education that I don't think exists in other, in many means. Maybe it exists in other spaces, but I think it is something unique that we can offer. Economically and professionally, I think that we can offer bilingual opportunities that make it so cultural keepers aren't exploited ad nauseum. Tourism's all fine and well, but through mass tourism that we seem to have settled on, we are asking cultural bearers to have unsustainable work. We're pushing to particularly in New Orleans, we're pushing them to the extremities of the city without public transportation, asking them to wait hours to come into the city for gigs that may pay the bills, but really are not helping long term. As if we want to like really be passing on, if we're helping cultural keepers really hold on to the culture. And so I think that through language we can. I think that through opportunities about investing in opportunities through concerts and film and just creating a whole parallel industry in which these people's facility with language, or even if it's not because they don't have to speak French or Creole or any heritage language per se, but if they are practicing traditions that are associated with these cultures, then we as institutions of civil society can invest back into them and maybe create more sustainable careers. And so I think that long term, that may be a real opportunity. And at a very macro level, I think that cities like New Orleans and Lafayette and these places really yearn to have an international image, to be known. And they are known, they really are known. And when you live in France, everyone's like, oh, la Nouvelle Orleans. Like, it's like, oh, la. And I think that's important, that beyond the cliche, that we can project an image of confidence, and I think language can project that. That if someone says, I want to go to New Orleans because they, even if it's not everyone, we don't have to be stereotyping ourselves. We don't need to like don berets and walk in the streets and speak French every day. What I want though is that people know that we invest in language here, that we invest in education, that we invest in opportunities, that even though it won't be done overnight, per my point earlier about it took policymakers 100 years to dismantle these cultures. It'll take us decades at least to help reconstitute some new iteration of them. And I think that, they're really cool, these cultures are cool. And I think if we reinvest in them, we reinvest in the people that are still keeping them alive, and then we offer them new opportunities, then I think it can only be up from there. And honestly, with the climate change in particular, the French, just taking French as an example, there's all these terms for a swamp. All of these terms from Louisiana French for a swamp. And I think it has to do with our proximity to the geography of this place. And I think that that's important because if we're going to try to make a case for saving the coast, then we gotta literally change the narrative. And I think that if we make the case for investing in languages, investing in people speaking these languages, then I think that we can switch over time the mentality of sort of extraction, of oil, of people, of all of these things that are happening that are just exacerbating this issue. And you'll notice the through line. When people speak French in Louisiana, they're a little bit more ecologically, I don't know what it is. It's something. There's some sort of stakeholdership, and maybe that's my point about the Katrina point earlier. When my grand-mère was sort of forlorn about the state of the state of the city post-Katrina, it was some sense that something went terribly wrong, and I think it had to do with her being anchored in that culture. And I think a lot of the heritage cultures of Louisiana have that same sense of forlorn. And I think that very long term, if we can educate children, if we can hold on to the kind of cultural keepers and support their ways, I think that we can very subtly nudge things in a different direction, because I think we can all agree about one thing in Louisiana right now. It ain't working. It really ain't working. People are leaving. The coast is crumbling. Our cities are becoming closer to the ocean. It's long term, we really, really got to be savvy. And I think language, culture, investment in people, investing in ideas is a way to make that happen.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for this interview. It's about 5:30 right now, just to give you a heads up. But thinking through, is there any, that's kind of the end of the structured session of things. But I wanted to give you a chance if there was anything that you felt like wasn't covered, or you felt like you needed a chance to say to the YouTube viewers.
I don't know. I think that was. I think it was pretty thorough. I mean, yeah. I think that kind of written, a little panorama of how I view things.
Yeah.
Trying to think any shout outs to people. Yeah, I think we covered most of it.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for your time. And
Great. I hope it's what you're looking for.
Yeah.